All right, we're live. Oh my gosh. All right.
Okay.
Well, to all the listeners, to all the watchers, to all the people out there, hi, welcome. And I'm Megan.
And I'm Rachel. And we are going to be talking about, we're just going to talk with you guys about some books that we're reading. And the one that we're into right now is called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff.
Yes, we're covering chapters 1 and 2 today. Our hope is to do one of these conversations a month, and hopefully we can keep that up. So, yeah, thanks for being here. And Rachel and I are going to have a fantastic time talking about this. So we hope you enjoy listening. So, Rachel, do you want to just go over what the book is about, like kind of what Zuboff's goal is, and then really dig into that front piece of the book where she lists her definite, like what she means by surveillance capitalism?
Yeah, I would love to do that. And I probably should have included the subtitle too, which is The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. And full disclosure, I do edit books, primarily nonfiction. So whenever I'm reading a book, there are certain things that I'm looking at and thinking about when I read a book, even just for my own enjoyment. I love how with this book, they actually open with on the first page a definition of surveillance capitalism. And that's something that I'm always telling authors to do. And I'm always looking for and critiquing when I'm reading is if you're going to use a term that you're going to wrap your whole argument around and function from, you have to define those terms and really clarify that for the reader. Because, and this is part of the I genuinely think this is part of the problem with most public discourse right now is we're all using words and it's such a broad sort of, we're able to talk to so many people in so many different places. Those words, it just have different meaning and context depending on where you are.
We think we think that everybody has the same definition. And then we'll find out, oops.
Yeah. And maybe that's a good, so I'm going to read her first. She actually has 8 definitions on this first page here. I want to read the first 2 for us just to get an idea of even some of her own, the authors, the implications, the subtext of these definitions. I think there definitely is a negative subtext that you're going to see when these are read. This is not a good thing. Surveillance capitalism is not a good thing, according to the author. But I would love to know, once I read these, Megan, if you want to just jump in and give me your thoughts. Do you think that these are good definitions, or do you feel like these are like robust, thick definitions that support this?
They withstand scrutiny.
Indeed. So let me just read the first 2, just so we are on the same page. So the first one, she says, is a new economic order that claims human experience as free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sale. And the second definition, she says, is a parasitic economic logic in which the production of goods and services is subordinated to a new global architecture of behavioral modification. So what is your take, or what strikes you even about those definitions?
Yeah. I was telling a friend of mine that I started reading this book and I was like, I feel a bit grim. There's no way not to, because I think the biggest thing that really struck me as I was reading these definitions and as I started reading this book is that, and I think you brought this up before when we were getting ready to talk about this, and I know this will come up again, is that it just highlights the asymmetry of power and resources.
Yeah.
And that really drives so much of what we're talking about, and use the we as like social collective kind of thing. Just so many of the resentments or the frustrations or the just feeling overwhelmed. And I think that both these definitions really point to asymmetry. Like it starts helping you realize the responses that you're having to everything that's going on are valid because it is so ubiquitous. It is this kind of network, for lack of a better word, it is this network within which we're embedded. And I think that they are robust, and I am curious to see how she's going to unpack these over the course of the book. And because it's one of those, whenever I read something like this and it resonates so much, I always question my resonance and that, am I resonating because this person has finally articulated something that I've suspected but haven't been able to say? Or is this resonated because I just want it to be true?
Yeah, totally. Is it like scratching an itch that I have? Is it like, am I on the same hobby horse? Yeah. I thought as well, I think what this gets at for me, or what strikes me at least, is it's to get back to the whole idea of resonance as a reader. And I do think that's important. That's something that I look for is this going to resonate in a way that a book is a commitment of time. And so anytime I'm reading, it's like, you've got to, not in a coercive way, but I do think in a meaningful way, could really clarify like what is going to hook a reader in to commit to spend time with you. Like, I agree with you. I was really glad we only did 2 chapters because it's a very heavy book, not just dense and actually, I don't feel like the content's actually that dense. It actually is a very smooth read for nonfiction. And unfortunately it has I'm not going to speak to, oh man, that is one thing that I'm like, it just drives me nuts. But so it's actually not as long as it looks is my point, because unless you're digging into the end notes, but it is very troubling, I think. And to engage this and consume large portions of it is, I don't know. You might be left feeling a bit hopeless, but I do feel like it's getting at the parasitic piece.
Yeah.
Really got at, I think, what makes me feel so cynical and hopeless at this particular historical moment. We were talking before we got on, and I was listening before we got on to the Supreme Court hearings about the TikTok ban. And just listening to the arguments and to the Supreme Court justices. Now, granted, I'm not like a law expert or anything, but just listening to all of this and the performative act as if they care about our data being protected, which is this whole thing. Oh, we care so much. Like, and the TikTok argument was more like, we just are asking to be like submitted to the same level of scrutiny other social media companies are being submitted to, right? And they're saying this is a threat of national security. They're subverting and twisting. This is a risk. A foreign power is twisting the end user's experience potentially. And we're so concerned about them, as if none of this book is happening right now.
Yeah.
There's been no concerted effort to like be concerned about me as the consumer and like what the negative formation activities of domestic actors are doing in my life with my data, and how that affects my formation and my entire posture of living. Because the parasitic piece felt very poignant and timely.
Yeah.
I think that's where everyone feels really exhausted, is they do feel like they're on one hand dependent on this technology, and on the other hand, it's like sucking the life out of them.
Right. Which is why the Matrix still feels like a really relevant metaphor, an image. That when Neo first wakes up and he sees these rows and rows of these pods, that's what this book feels like. Of pulling back that veil of opacity and also to draw from another pop culture image, it feels like the Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. So I think those were the kind of images that were really coming to mind for me when I started reading this and I was thinking about it. And I was also trying to think of what were some of the key themes. And I think both of these first two definitions really get at the key themes. Like the other 6 are interesting and helpful, and we'll touch on them. But I feel like the first 2 are really the ones to pay attention to in the sense of, what does she mean by surveillance capitalism? And what does that mean for you and me as the average person on the street? And I meant to say this earlier, but for listeners, both Rachel and I come at everything from a Protestant Christian theological perspective. Some of our opinions, some of what we say is probably going to be rooted in Christian tradition.
And we'll probably have some things to say about the life of the church and what we would consider like how this sort of overlays with some of our Christian traditions. But I think there'll be some insights in here that also largely just have to do with what it means to be human in this particular moment.
What does it mean to be human in a moment that's just hostile to that humanity? And so gonna use this book to explore those. And I really saw 3 that I'm curious about, and that I think the first 2 definitions really hint at, and I'm curious to see how she's going to explore these. And these themes, 2 of the themes really relate to her elemental rights that she talks about. And she says that these are rights that bear on individual sovereignty. And so that the first one is the right to the future tense. And she describes that as our ability to imagine, intend, promise, and construct a future. And then she also talks about the right to sanctuary, which is what she describes as the human need for a space of inviolable refuge. And so I see that as sanctuary as like privacy. What does it mean to have a private life in this context? It's kind of moment. And what does it mean to have a future when so much of what we're interacting with is manipulating our choices? What does it mean to make choices in that context? And then the other theme that she's hinting at is woven throughout, but half the title is economics. Like understand, like what is an economic system and the and that system's relation to morality. Because one of the other books that I've read recently by Daniel Bell called The Economy of Desire, he talks about how any economic system is an engine of desire. It's started by our choices, and then it runs on our choices, and then it shapes on our choices. And one of the things that I'm really curious about is how basically all economic systems that we interact with, and especially why we have like #capitalism these days, is because it seems completely untethered from any moral framework whatsoever. And I'm not even talking about a religious framework. I'm just talking about some sense of virtue, some sense of common good. And how did these people that are making these choices, that are driving these technologies and building these companies, how did they come to decide? How did they come to make these choices that say, I don't care about all of these other people? They're just there to be raw data.
Yeah. I'm always so fascinated that if you critique capitalism in a conservative evangelical audience, for the most part, in the West, in my spaces, they're like, oh, so you want to be a communist. You hate the West. Why don't you just leave this country? That's the kind of response I typically get in my circles is, oh, so you hate everything. You're like, no, that's actually not at all what I'm saying here. And I actually loved the corrective that Shoshana offers here when she's talking about the ways that deregulation evolved capitalism over time. Yeah. And I do want to point out one thing just for our listeners here, because I think this is an important piece of the felt need is, and you hinted at this with the shaping of behavior. Mm-hmm. Surveillance capitalism, she's arguing, and her definition of this is not any data collection on a person. Like, she's not saying that data collection itself is bad. She opens with this vignette of the smart home before there was like Google Home and Nest, and it was actually like that data was actually supposed to benefit the user in their home.
It assumed the people that were creating it assumed privacy, assumed that you as an individual would maintain control over who could access your data for what purpose.
And her point is that what's happened now, because this has all been so deregulated and nobody's noticed what's going on, she gives this other little, I thought, very arresting story of this, or this metaphor, if you will, of the Spanish conquistadors coming to Latin America. And it's this challenge, the phenomenon of the unprecedented. She actually has a great line here. Let me see if I can find it quickly. It's just, this is how the she tells a story about the conquistadors, and then she says something along the lines of like, they welcomed them. They didn't recognize their armor. They didn't recognize their guns. And they welcomed the gods, if you will, with open arms and hospitality. And she says, and this is how the unprecedented reliably confounds understanding existing lenses illuminate the familiar, thus obscuring the original by turning the unprecedented into an extension of the past, which to me, that was like, oh yes, that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
Also like freaked the crap out of me. So I'm like, oh, what is being introduced to us? And we literally have no idea. We can't understand.
Yeah. And that I thought I latched on to that same sentence, that same section too, because what she's describing is what I learned communication theory. I also have a communications background.
Be a little more specific for our listeners. You don't just have a communications background, okay? Megan has a master's degree. Can you explain a little bit of that to our listeners?
Yes, I studied. So there's communication and there's communications. Communications tends to deal with technologies, tools, practices, and all that stuff. Communication tends to deal with theories and processes and how it takes a step back and dissects and analyzes the different ways that humans actually communicate with each other and what communication does in our lives. So it's not necessarily about using social media or crafting a PR campaign. It's a step back. It's like, how do we communicate and what does communication do in the world? And so when I was reading that, the unprecedented is necessarily unrecognizable. It reliably confounds understanding, and our existing lenses illuminate the familiar, thus obscuring the original by turning the unprecedented into an extension of the past. And what that resonated for me was this theory called sense making. And it's created by Carl Weick. And it basically is talking about how the only way we learn things and the only way that we make sense of things, because when we get a new experience, like what we're talking about here, Shoshana Zuboff talking about surveillance capitalism, is it's new. It's the only, like, our best way to reduce uncertainty, to navigate the ambiguity of this new thing is specifically to connect it to our old experiences and to figure out, like, how does this become part of that story? And so she's talking about that and you can't do that. Or she's saying that doesn't work. And so one of the things I was thinking about is when we're sense making and we are connecting it to our old, like the temptation is to collapse old and new, to smooth out the unfamiliar and to find what is familiar and make it fit with what's clear. And so I think what Shoshana is telling us is you have to let the contradiction stand.
Yeah, that's good.
You have to... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is why it's so infuriating when you have these conversations with people and you say, hey, there's something wrong with capitalism. There's something wrong that's happening right now. And what's doubly infuriating is that the biggest sort of silencers of this sort of creative exploration of what is wrong, because if what you're saying is true, this, like, we can't smooth this out. We actually have to let this contradiction stand. This, like, rogue, she called, like, rogue sort of evolution of capitalism. We have to be creative and start to dig in and say, okay, what is different, and explore that and ask questions. Is that sometimes in the religious space, they're actually the most defensive about even exploring these things. And I'm like, wow, this is just so discouraging, because there could be such rich conversations, I think, when we were talking about the ways that theology intersects with, and it's really interesting. I didn't tell you this earlier, Megan, but I'm actually reading a manuscript right now on Sabbath by two theologians, and they actually had this book in their bibliography and in their footnotes. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is very interesting, because they're looking at Sabbath from a very different lens, not just from, oh, here's 6 practices for Sabbath. It's more, what is our current historical moment doing in the ways that it, like, shifts our very way of being in the world? And what is Sabbath theologically about? How's that supposed to shape the way that we actually exist in this current?
Sure.
And so I thought this was very interesting that they had looked at this book and it was in their bibliography. But I going back to that felt need, because I'm sure there's still some, like, people who are listening, they're like, I still don't really understand what this means for me.
Sure.
Like, why when I read this book? And for me, I think if you actually care about what it means to be human, I don't think that's that's not just a Christian question. I think a lot of people are asking that question from their spaces. But she has this line on page 9 where she says, just as industrial capitalism was driven to the continuous intensification of the means of production, so surveillance capitalists and their market players are now locked into the continuous intensification of the means of behavioral modification, and the gathering might of instrumentation power. So I thought that was really interesting. She does this thing which is just like industrial capitalism, so surveillance capitalism. Like if it's a this, then that. She does it again when she says it revives Karl Marx's old image of capitalism as a vampire that feeds on labor, but with an unexpected turn. Instead of labor, surveillance capitalism feeds on every aspect of every human's experience. Which I think that matters. I think when you're feeling that sort of hopelessness and ennui and cynicism and nihilism that is just so pervasive today, when you're looking at the situation, the very like polarized conversations that are happening and the economic frustration that people are experiencing, this book is getting behind those things. It's saying the tech is not the problem. The ideology behind the tech. This is why I get so frustrated with this. Let's keep kids off of phones. No screen time. It's such an elitist. And it's such a superficial way of having this conversation.
It's also dealing with the most obvious last point.
Yes.
It's not dealing with any of the choices or actions that came before.
And this is the whole thing with
it takes time.
And I haven't listened to hate stuff on Anxious Generation. I'm sure you're probably more into it than I am, but I just wonder to myself, like, did he have children? I don't know if he has kids, but I have had this conversation time and time again with my daughter. And because we listened to one of his podcasts on the way to work. We're using like a short, it might have been like with the Daily or I don't remember what it was. Doesn't matter. That's not important. What's important is she's listening and they're like, we should come up with this like social contract and keep kids off phones till whenever. And she's like, that only works if everyone agrees to that social contract. Like when my 13-year-old can figure out that this is a problem, what are we even doing? I just find most of the conversation is just totally missing. Of course, these kids are getting formed by these malformed, if you will, by these algorithms and taking their space, but it's still the landscape where they are making plans with one another. They are building social interactions with one another. They are learning to communicate with one another, for better or worse. And it would benefit us to stop having this conversation about, do we need yonder pouches in the schools to take away their phones? Guess what? So crazy. I'm going to point this out too. If I open my phone and I get on TikTok right now, I will not stop scrolling. You will literally have to pry my phone from my cold dead fingers to get me to stop scrolling. I will lay there and do nothing. Here's what's crazy to me. And I don't know if you've had this experience too. When I get on Blue Sky, when I'm done and I don't think about it. And then when I want to get back on, I do it. I think there's something to the fact that they are like, they're doing this thing. They're saying like the tech is not bad. It's the ideology behind it. And there's so much availability to customize your algorithm to what you want to see, your feed to what you want to see on Blue Sky that shocker, I'm not a freaking addict all the time to Blue Sky, but stick me on Twitter and I'm doom scrolling until I don't know, just curl in on myself. Right.
That's the thing. That's one of the things that I was really thinking about. And I've had this thought for a while, and it wasn't until I read Age of Surveillance Capitalism where I was able to connect it. Because this question that I've had for a long time is, why does the pursuit of authenticity now, or an authentic self, feel like this constant process of customization? And it's because of the surveillance, like it's because of these voices that Zuboff is talking about. We're being herded into these behaviors that share ever more finely tuned data.
It's crazy.
And I love this phrase. This is such a terrifying phrase, but it's such a good phrase. Behavioral futures market. That's what she used.
That is so horrifying. And I think that's the other point that people, just to emphasize, the behavioral futures market is what we're talking about. We're saying this book is not about, did Walmart find out that you liked black beans, so they send you another message that black beans are on sale this week? It's not that. It's that there's such a massive asymmetry of knowledge. They are taking so much. They point out there's a whole section about terms of service, which was like comical. You can't read them all. They talk about the fact that now the terms of service and that they're all like digital now. Like you can make them as long as you want, or you can make them as short as you want, or you can change them whenever you want. And they're able to then extract so much information from us, never for our benefit though. For the benefit, you have to be thinking in this dysregulated country, any benefit you think that you're getting. Oh, I get really cool recommendations of coupons at Jewelosco when I like go or whatever. Like the companies are getting so much more data on you than you even can comprehend.
And that's what comes back to that right to the future tense that she talked about. Because it's not that Walmart knows that you buy a lot of black beans. It's that somewhere, somebody is looking at the accumulation and the average of all that kind of data and is saying, it's just picture a bunch of people on the floor of Wall Street. That's what's going on with the data. And what that's doing is you don't even realize that somebody else is opening and closing options for you.
Yeah.
And that's what Zuboff is saying. I think I'm saying her name wrong. Zuboff. Yeah. And that's what she's saying is that is an elemental human right, is to be able to understand the choices that are available to you and to choose one over the other. And what surveillance capitalism is doing is saying, you don't even have the choices you think you do. You have the choices we give you.
Yes. And she says this in the book. She says, much of this new work is accomplished under the banner of personalization, a camouflage for aggressive extraction operations that mine the intimate depths of everyday life. Like they literally, there's this great story too, which there is a line here I want to say at some point, maybe we'll get there, but there's this one section in there where they tell the story of this poor man. Where I cackled when he was talking about the engagement ring and he bought on Overstock. And then Overstock sells the data. Yeah. The story was basically for our listeners that this man, as an example she's giving, is that this like man is telling the story about purchasing a diamond engagement ring for his girlfriend in preps of like this New Year's Eve proposal. But he says, imagine my horror when I learned that Overstock had published the details of my purchase, including a link to the item and its price on my public Facebook newsfeed, as well as notifications to all of my friends, including my girlfriend, all her friends. All of this was without my consent and knowledge. And that's the point. Is we can't even comprehend what it is we're consenting to now and how that affects our future behavior and what that means for our future behavior.
Yeah. And one of the things that she talks about at the very end of chapter 2, she talks about this case that was launched in Spain that I think led to the European privacy that now everybody has to abide by.
The right to, what is it? The right to, what is it called? Not exist, but the right to, there's like a phrase.
Very end. Let's see. Spanish Data Protection Agency. And I love what she said. They recognize that not all information is worthy of immortality. Some information should be forgotten because that is only human.
Yes.
And that goes back to that theory of sense making that I talked about. When we're sense making, we're not recalling every single related episode that directly connects to the new experience. We're recalling selected episodes that stand out specifically, or that we've remembered because they make us feel good, or we don't remember because they make us feel bad. And so we've constructed a particular history.
Yeah.
Because we've forgotten certain things. And what surveillance capitalism, what behavior modification, what the data collection that Zuboff is specifically talking about, data collection for the purpose of a futures market, is it's not allowing you to forget anything.
No. And if it is, this is like the whole conversation, but think about this. I actually had two thoughts about the whole right to be forgotten thing. My first thought, separate to this, was like, wow, it's so rich that like the evangelical church seems to forget all the wrong things. We can't have a database for sexual assault perpetrators in the church.
Right.
And we're going to give them grace to start anew and forget, right? The church will do that kind of tomfoolery all the time, right? Actually arguing for the same thing. But most of those people too are going to be like huge fans of like deregulation. And it's very interesting, the cognitive dissonance. But what was the other thing I was going to say about, I don't remember. Anyway, it'll come back.
But yeah, I thought the right to privacy, the ability to forget. There's a book, I forget the author's name, but it's called The Metaphors We Live By. It's literally just a listing, a collection of different kinds of metaphors, agricultural metaphors, machine metaphors. And it just goes like when you see all of these different categories of metaphors, like the different ways, you start realizing how that shapes, again, communication, the words, what does language do when we're using it. And we start thinking of ourselves as machines, and we start pathologizing ourselves for not remembering everything. We start pathologizing ourselves for not keeping up the pace that a machine would. But we're not machines.
We're not. And we can't.
We joke about, I do not compute. My brain is at capacity. Those are all programming and technological language. We're not. And so so all of this is it's very interesting. And as I was reading this, so tied to the privacy sanctuary, the behavior manipulation, the economics morality, I was also really struck with dichotomies. We have convenience and we have smooth and easy. So I also read over the weekend Byung-Chul Han's The Transparency Society.
Okay.
And so privacy and transparency are just diametrically opposed. And so he talks about how easy, like smooth, positive. And that's what the ideology behind these kinds of technologies are trying to do. Sure, you want to find information to build something at home. Like, you don't want it to be hard, but at the same time, it's all that convenience has morphed into Amazon's one-click buy now. Or do you know how freaking hard it is to find the add to list? Deliberately. They don't want you to add it to a list and think about it.
They just want you to buy it.
Yeah. So smooth, like convenience versus inaccessibility or difficulty or friction. Positive versus negative. Transparency versus privacy. Control versus agency. Growth. And that's another thing when we talk about like the economics and all those like, growth at any cost versus sufficiency. And then certainty versus equivocality or ambiguity. Sort of like the dichotomies that were really cropping up for me when I was reading and thinking about this.
Yeah, I want to go back to that one about friction and like the smoothness. That was actually one that stuck out to me, and Matt and I were talking about that last night. And one of the things that like I would actually mind a little more friction in my life. Like we forget, remember like in the 90s, like you'd go to the bookstore and find a book, or the record store, find this like CD or like whatever that was like new, and you're going to try it and see and find out. And the internet used to be like that too, a little bit more. Right now, it's like all of a sudden we woke up one day and we're like, oh, like everything feels AI generated. It feels uncanny valley. It's giving everything's a paid advertisement from Google at this point. Remember when you would search something and you would get like 20 blogs, and now 3 pages of paid ads or like SEO crap that you're like, okay. But what's interesting to me about the friction piece is that I actually wouldn't mind some friction, but who has time for friction anymore? That's part of the problem. Is if I'm expected to work 40 hours a week and take my kids to, because you know what? Like I'm a shitty mom. If like my kids don't like, they're not in 3 million sports, and you can say, oh, you don't have to do that. But then what are my kids doing? They're on screens all day long. Why? Because I have to work so that I can pay for my kids to have their lives. And then I'm in trouble because my kids are on screens all day. So when I'm running around taking 3 kids to 3 extracurriculars and making sure they're not getting in trouble while I'm working 40 hours a week, then we're like, of course, we're going to go toward what is most frictionless. And if I can buy the like purple pipe cleaners that the 2nd grade class needs for a class party, I don't have time to go to Michael's and call around. Like that feels like such an approach of the past.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of years ago, I started collecting vinyl. And I have a record player, and my collection is
Mhm.
very small. And that's deliberate because, yeah,
Mhm.
I know I could get on a fantastic website that trades new and used and vintage vinyl and all that stuff. I don't want to. I
Mhm.
want to go to a record store and I
Yeah.
want to flip through each individual one and I want to know, oh, I'm looking for X, Y, or Z. And if
Mhm.
I don't find it today, that's okay. And if I do find it, it's gonna be a little bit like Gollum in the ring.
Yeah, exactly. There's
Because
something
I
really
took time and I was willing to wait for it because it's not the having it, it's the knowing that I'm gonna find the perfect thing that's gonna complete what I want in my collection for the time. It's
yeah,
okay.
I'm not trying to be just like back in the good old days, but there is
Right.
something like, I think the technology has grown at such an exponential rate
Mhm.
that we
Yeah.
really do have the memory of the good old days of the internet, and the good
Mhm.
old days of the way that the internet functioned, because it's changed so rapidly. I can remember 20 years ago, right? I can
Mhm.
remember, what, 15 years ago when the iPhone was like just coming out or whatever.
Yep.
And like a
Yeah.
few people had them, to
Mhm.
now where it's like
Right.
ubiquitous. Smartphones are ubiquitous.
And I
So
think
for me, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say these kinds of technologies, I can't tell you how many times having a banking app on my phone has saved my bacon. Um,
Hmm.
so that's the kind of thing that's not the kind of thing we're talking about. It's whatever somebody does with the data that's collected off the banking app.
To push you.
But
Yeah.
no, but these things were originally sold as a convenience to us, and we're like, great,
Yes.
sure, fine. And that's also tying into we haven't even talked about, like, attention and all that stuff, and that's a whole other we could read a whole different
Yeah.
book on that. But what's really struck me with this is somewhere somebody was like, "Oh, hey, we can do things with this technology, we can all of this stuff." And somebody somewhere was like, "Hey, you know what? Because we can, that means we should."
Yeah. It's the good
And
old
I'm like,
Jurassic
"No,
Park. It's the good old
who told
Jurassic
you that
Park.
was okay?"
Yeah. It's the Jeff Goldblum. Everybody was so concerned about whether we could. Nobody stopped to ask if we should. Jeff Goldblum, Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park is the best. He's the best part of that whole movie. I
It's
think this
called
goes
Blue
back
Forever.
I think this goes back to this whole and I'll go back to, okay, what is this book going to be about? I do anticipate that there's going to be some constructive ideas here. It's
Yeah,
not just going to be a destructive book.
sure.
And that kind of excites me because she points out here that I think she says something along the lines of search engines don't retain your history. Surveillance capitalism retains your
Right,
search
right.
history, right?
Yeah,
It's the ideology that makes the choice to say,
yeah,
we're going to
yeah,
retain all of that. And the
right.
piece that really slammed it home for me that I love this little, like, it's the distillation, nothing new, but it goes back to what we were saying, like when people get on your case for critiquing capitalism. But she's talking about this French economist, Thomas Piketty, and this sort of like rate of return that he on capital, where he basically is arguing that the rate of return on capital tends to exceed the rate of economic growth. So this R is greater than G. And she points out that it's a dynamic that produces ever more extreme income divergence, and with it, a range of anti-democratic social consequences long predicted as harbingers of an eventual crisis in capitalism. And then she says, indeed, a 2015 New York Times report concluded that 158, this was just mind-boggling, 158 US families and their corporations provided almost half. And I'm sure it's more than this
Yeah.
now that like Citizens United repeal has, or that court case has just like infested everything that we do now. 176 million of all the money that was raised by both political parties in support of presidential candidates in 2016, primarily in support of Republican candidates who have pledged to pare regulations, cut taxes, and shrink entitlements, which is not
Yeah.
good for
Yeah.
our data. And then she says at the end, and I loved this, she said that basically, to state his Piketty's research simply, capitalism should not be eaten raw.
Yeah.
Capitalism, like sausage, is meant to be cooked by a democratic society and its
Mhm.
institutions, because raw capitalism is antisocial. And I thought that was such a good, this is what I've been trying to say to people. It's not that I let's get rid of capitalism and all go be communists. I don't actually really care. The point is that, and she makes this whole point up to this is the big reveal, is that when we had the progressive era and there were regulations, the sort of double regulation of collective bargaining and unions and all of these things, capitalism was doing quite well. It was doing quite well for the people. It was doing quite well. But once
and she used the word a reciprocity.
She
said,
there was
again, that moral framework,
yes.
it recognized that it has some sort of responsibility to the society.
Yes.
People are, and that's the thing that I'm really curious about as well, because what we're talking about is a system of incentives and choices. And I'm curious if, as we read this book, get a better sense of what those incentives are.
Yeah.
Money and power, just like a blanket. Money and power, that's always the incentive.
That's just what I don't really understand. I hear just double speak around this whole platform of deregulation, as if we deregulate it, that the average man at this point in time with the asymmetry that we have, be so for real. Do you really think that if we deregulated all this crap, that average Joe me is going to get a portion of the pie? The game is already rigged. Deregulate all you want at this point. You're not getting a piece of the pie. You are a pawn in a system. You are an instrument. She uses that instrumentalization language. And do you not see the cognitive
people as enemies?
Do you not see the cognitive dissonance there? That you are voting for a platform that says we will benefit if we can instrumentalize people, and maybe you'll have a chance too. It's like going to the carnival and playing a carnival game. Sure, maybe you'll be the lucky winner. Come on, even my kids know at this point the games are
always wins.
My kids even know these games are rigged against them, right? When they go places at this point. And there's no trying really hard that's going to get you the main prize. But I guess that's my question is, at what point do you say the ideology behind this that you're questioning is so we're all cool with just instrumentalizing our fellow man for this? But that seems so gross.
I love how she points out, many scholars have taken to describing these new conditions, which is what you've just been talking about, as neo-feudalism. Marked by the consolidation of elite wealth and power far beyond the control of ordinary people and the mechanisms of democratic consent. Again, this massive asymmetry, because science fiction writer Isaac Asimov has this quote. Let me see if I can find it so I can use it.
No, but that line that you just had was actually key. And I want to point out what she goes on to say right after that, because she actually points out this is a key juncture in her argument, because she's actually pulling together the neo-feudalism with the individualization there. Because then she goes on to say, we now have the tools to grasp the collision in all of its destructive complexity. What is unbearable is that economic and social inequalities have reverted to the pre-industrial feudal patterns, but we, the people, have not. We are not illiterate peasants, serfs, or slaves. Whether middle class or marginalized, we share the collective historical condition of individualized persons with complex social experiences and opinions. And I think that is the heart of why we all are. She's really digging right there at the felt need right now. Right. What's going on.
Yeah. I can't find the quote, but it essentially says that any technology that's sufficiently advanced and complex enough that you can't just immediately understand it automatically feels like magic.
Yeah.
And that's where so much of this asymmetry is coming in. And what you just described is we're not stupid. We do have education. And it's not that the technology is unfamiliar to us. It's moving at such a pace. Algorithms are if-then statements. That's it. It's just the thing is we now have so many if-then statements stacked on top of each other that it probably just looks like a Gordian knot if you were to lift up the hood. And so many of these, and so many interacting, so many different sets of algorithms interacting, that there's no way to make sense of it. There's no way to point at any one thing and go, oh, tug that thread out. You tug it out and the whole deck of cards falls apart.
Yeah. And I wonder, based on what I've seen from hearings from Congress when they're talking to Zuckerberg and all the rest and all his cronies and whatever. Oh man, they just seem so inept at even being able to. So our elected officials at worst are in the pockets of these people to deregulate, to incentivize them to deregulate these things, right? They're not working for the people. They're working for the businesses. Or at best, they don't even know what's going on when they're asking. They're like asking questions about Wi-Fi and stuff like that. And you're like, oh God.
And that's really the book that I just started reading is called Invisible Rulers by Renee DiResta. She really dug it. She got started because she lived in California and she was pulled into this question of how does all this happen with vaccine issues, like vaccine bill and anti-vaxxers in California. And then she really got into it with COVID-19. And she said, it was one thing to try to talk about all of this stuff, like in our advocacy group or with people who study technology and all this stuff. But it was another thing to try to talk about it with any sort of political office or whatever, because the literal response was, those are just some people on the internet.
Yeah, it's so interesting to just see how...
And that was their level of understanding of what happens on the internet.
I know. We know, you and I know at a individual, like in our experiences in the workforce together. We know that there's plenty of people that like do not understand how the internet works and how communication works on the internet. And these are the people that run these organizations. That being said, it's even more disturbing when our policymakers don't even know the right line of inquiry to have. And they just are all of these tech bros are just running. So now we have a tech bro who's functionally like running the government. So TBD on what's going to happen there. Yeah. But like that, if nobody sees, obviously collectively, the country is like, that's not a problem. Everything's going to get better. We're going to get rid of all of this waste or whatever. I'm like, huh? You think billionaire tech bros are doing it out of the goodness of their heart? There's something in it for them.
You know me, like my capacity for details on some things is just like out the window. But there was a point at which Zuckerberg or Facebook or Meta was getting called to Congress sometime in the last couple of years. And Facebook released documents showing how I think the Biden administration had tried to put pressure or whatever. And everyone was like, oh, we're just so glad to see that he's shedding light on this. I'm like, do you not understand that he's literally waving one hand and trying to get you not to pay attention to the other? Or at least sit now because he doesn't want to go to he doesn't want you to pay attention to the conversations that's happening on Capitol Hill.
No. And also, what about everyone just conveniently forgotten like the Cambridge Analytica scandal? It's just truly like shocking. Mark Zuckerberg, bless his heart, he has approximately 1% of the collective 4% of wealth that millennials have.
Yeah.
That's just not a guy that's your buddy. Do you really believe that they have your best interests as a consumer in mind? Mm-hmm. It just feels, it's so, I think the shame is going to be that for all of our talk about a theological imagination in the church, right? When we look back, we're just going to see that we were pawns in a game.
We were using the culture and we were using the technology.
It's so sad. It's so embarrassing.
I was thinking about, I was listening to this. Let me see if I can find yes. So I was listening to this podcast, Truth Over Tribe. And the hosts of the podcast are about to release a new book. And it's talking about 6 ways Christians can change the culture. And I don't know, I'm guessing from what little I've heard them talk about, an update on Niebuhr's Christ and Culture.
Yeah.
It's kind of a little bit more of a more relevant. Are you a trainer? Are you an artist? Are you that kind of thing? And I just today, shameless plug, on my newsletter posted an article about symbolic interactionism, which is another communication theory. And I've just been studying it, so it's fresh. And I was like, oh, now I get why conversations around Christians engaging the culture are so frustrating and so far off the mark. Because this phrasing and this attitude assumes that culture is something out there that we can toggle in and out of at will. And what symbolic capitalism, what any communication theory really can do, and the communication theories that I specifically really resonate with, is social construction of meaning. Culture comes every single time you interact.
Yeah.
Culture arises every single time you interact. It's every single time you approach somebody or some issue, or you respond to a situation, you're deciding what factors and what priorities you're bringing to that interaction. And you're deciding, you're trying, again, for lack of a better word, you're trying to manipulate the future result that's going to happen. And
Yeah.
so engaging the culture is pointless because the culture doesn't exist.
Mhm.
The culture is a result of your interactions with
Reactions. Yeah.
different people every single day. Again,
Yes.
we're back to incentives and choices. What are the
Yeah.
incentives and what are the choices for all of this? And so that's a question that to me is interesting because that comes down, again, future tense, privacy, but that comes to personal agency. That comes to who are we? Who are we
I,
becoming? Do we even want to be? Do we want to be
yeah.
the people that we are?
I think a lot of Christians are really petrified of the idea that they actually don't have a lot of agency in this. That's why I think conversations around like hermeneutics are really threatening to people. When we're talking about interpreting scripture, we're like, hey, you actually bring yourself to the text. And that means that when you read, it's mediated through your reading, and interpretation is mediated through your experience. And that sounds really threatening to a lot of people because it means, oh, well, how do I know objective truths? How do I know what's true? But it's the same thing about being in the world, what you're just saying. It's like they want to believe that they have like agency over their motivations. And this is another thing that I wanted to bring up today from this section is they go through this whole history of American sort of engagement with capitalism and how this worked. And she talks about how the disaggregation and diminishment of the U.S. public firm. And she says that the public corporation as a social institution was reinterpreted as a costly error, and its longstanding reciprocities with customers and employees were recast as destructive violations of market efficiency. And then she basically goes on to say, quotes this guy Jensen, who basically says that we're at the eclipse of public corporation. And then they point out, which was crazy, that by 2000, the public corporations employed fewer than half as many Americans than they did in 1970, which I had no idea. And then in 2009, there were only half as many public firms as in 1997, which is shocking to me. I would have never assumed that. But then this is the line that got me. She says, in the process, the cult of the entrepreneur would rise as the near mythic prominence as the perfect union of ownership and management, replacing the rich existential possibilities of the second modernity with a single glorified template of audacity, competitive dominance, and wealth. And I just think it's really interesting that the most successful pastors out there, right, are the audacious, competitive. They wouldn't call themselves cunning. They use a nice word, strategic, right? Dominance and wealth. And then we're all shocked. We're all shocked when these guys end up being like complete assholes. We're like, oh, one could have never seen that coming. Actually, if you just read history, you would know that this is the product of our historical moment. It's not this like God thing where God's, I appoint you, Mr. High on the D on the disc thing. You are the best candidate possible. It's no, our times are dictating what we are elevating and platforming.
Yeah, I know. Oh my gosh. Because you and I have both read Andy Root's books, The Church in a Secular Age. And you know my frustration, fantastic diagnostician. And then the last quarter of the book for me always devolves. I'm like, where are you going, dude? But fantastic diagnostician. He does such a great job of interlocuting with Taylor, with Hahn, with all of these guys. And one of his books, The Church After Innovation, he literally takes a look at what you just talked about, of that entrepreneurial, like everyone has to be an entrepreneur. And I think that's really one of the things that Zuboff talks about. She goes through the first modernity, and she says that marks the time when life became individualized. So one of the things, Charles Taylor, magisterial work, A Secular Age, formative for a great many people these days. Taylor, I think Rosa with Social Acceleration.
Yeah.
Several of these books are really taking a big look at that macro shift from the pre-modern to the modern era.
Mhm.
Why did religious belief go from, so many things about human life go from accepteds and givens to up for grabs. And so they're looking at that shift. And one of the things when Zuboff talks about first modernity, second modernity, and third modernity, I think she's actually looking at those micro shifts in modernity
Yeah.
where, we still had some givens, some social givens. The likelihood you were a farmer and you were born to a farmer, you were still likely going to be a farmer, even up until maybe the 40s or the 50s.
Yeah.
But then first modernity, she talks and she links it to that industrial capitalism, like the era of mass production, when Ford really was able to bring down the costs of production, bring down the cost to the consumer, and expand access to produce good to a greater number of people. But she says first modernity marks the time when the life became individualized.
Yeah.
And says that now we experience both the right and the requirement to choose our own lives. And I thought that was such an interesting,
Yeah.
and that's what Root is talking about. That's what you're getting at with the entrepreneurial. And that's what we're seeing so much shift, like this public corporation and these huge corporations now, they really are divesting of any kind of responsibility to the employee whatsoever.
Oh yeah, totally. So this whole us growing up, like this like loyalty to company, it doesn't work anymore. There's no virtue in it. So I had a couple thoughts about this entrepreneurial language. I actually wonder if when we talk about things in the church world about pastoral burnout and how we've siloed that conversation from these larger economic conversations, and if that's actually like a huge problem and coming up with the solution. If we're forcing pastors in order to be, and it's really interesting, this goes back to Ryan Burge, just wrote an article about the rise of non-denominationalism, that it was a blip on, you could forgive people that were doing statistical analysis for almost ignoring the blip that was the non-denominational church in the 70s. And now, how much it's grown, it is the thing that is growing, right? As mainline dies, this grows. Is it shocking to any of us? I know Christians will like sit around and be like, the non-denominational church, it really grew because it's like hitting people's felt needs. And it's like, we're reaching the unchurched and hashtag I love my church and blah, all these things. Is it that? Or
hashtag belonging before believing.
Yeah, belong before believe. Yeah. Is it that, or is it actually that this is what the economic conditions allow? This is what they allow for. And this is the only thing they allow for is the pastor who is able to be a startup and a group of people that's willing to be a startup company. And then the kind of leader that's required for that. It's not a Eugene Peterson. And I think that's the sad part. It's like not a like guy or a girl who like is like hanging around reading books and visiting people at hospitals and living a life of prayer. If that's what I honestly feel like in order for that world to work, it requires like a group of people who really are also interested in kind of the same like spiritual values in order to make that happen, or a bivocational pastor. Like and then you're running into the same gig economy crap that we just were talking about. It's going to burn you out inevitably. And at what expense?
The other thing too in that book, Invisible Rulers, that I just started. So I just started it, so I haven't had a chance to like really sit there and think about it. But she really she's really specifically to looking at propaganda, like communication as propaganda. But she's talking about, let me see if I can find my notes. Okay. A new system of incentives has given rise to novel forms of propaganda and tools for manipulation. Shared reality has splintered into bespoke realities, shaped by recommendation engines that bring communities together, filled with curated content from the media and influencers that the community trusts. And what you were just talking about, the pastor, like the non-denominational church, that's a microcosm of this idea. Yeah, it's not about the substance so much of the gospel.
No.
as it is. It's about cult of personality, and this particular person speaking from the front of the room has figured out a way to speak in a way that people are like what I was saying earlier at the beginning of our conversation. Is it resonating because she's actually hitting something, or is it resonating because I want it to be true?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it resonating for people because they want it to be true more than it's actually saying something accurate and true and helpful?
I used to, as a kid, like not understand that like religion is the opium of the masses. What did that mean? I thought it was just like some like terrible communist atheist thing that like people said. And I was like, this must be sinful. But like when I think about that now, and I think about actually the ways that religion interacts with people's being in the world, I understand and at least empathize with that critique, right? That you're asking, does it say something they just want to hear? Yeah, I think sometimes it does. And what it's doing is it's not really offering anything meaningful that will shift the first order problem, which is the system. It's really a second order individual problem. That's, I feel better about myself and now I can sleep at night, even though like my job is exploiting me and I'm exhausted and there's nothing I can really do about that. It's a little bit frustrating, I think, to see the ways that white Western, it's not happening the same ways in Latin America. This is not happening the same ways in Africa. But the ways that white, Western, evangelical framework is interfacing with our economic realities is really disappointing. I truly think it's probably one of the most disappointing. And politics and economics with religion probably is one of the most disappointing things I've witnessed in my adult life.
Yeah.
With the church.
I would agree with that. Because you and I both attended seminary. I think you did much better at it. You won harder than I did. But when you and I both attended, we both still, thankfully, it didn't beat any of the faith in Jesus out of us. I think one of the things that happens when you really actually interact with the text yourself, when you really actually approach it as the revelation of a divine speaker, and you start listening to what that revelation said in the Gospels. And you start realizing, you just, okay, that's not what I heard when I was growing up.
Yeah.
That's not what I thought it was about based on what I was taught. And I realized, like, no wonder so many people are so frustrated and disillusioned. I think Russell Moore said this really well in one of his newsletters. Like, of course, young people aren't coming to the church. Why should they believe in this thing when we don't believe it?
Oh, yeah. I think that's the grossest part of the whole thing. And I will offer this caveat. I think when it comes to me and my critiques, like, all of my critiques are going to be like, don't want listeners to hear this and be like, oh, if she critiques this, she must be that. Oh, if she critiques the evangelical church, she must be an atheist then, or an agnostic. Or if she critiques the Republican Party, she must be a Democrat. Like, none of that is actually true. And I do want to point out this book is not critiquing the Republican Party. It's critiquing neoliberalism, right? Yeah. And the ways that neoliberalism became the channel and the avenue at which surveillance capitalism was like biding its time and then was able to come in.
It happens that conservative players and actors have managed to work and manipulate and make it work for them really well.
And I would say some Democrats have as well, but I particularly have a beef against the Republicans is because of how it has been conflated with the religious attitudes that of course, as a Christian, I will value the Republican values. And when you really start to unpack, so of course I'm going to critique what I come from. I have no interest in, I am not the kind of Christian that sits here, wants to critique leftists and atheists all day long. That is of no interest of me. If you would like to listen to a critique of any of those, like those positions, like they all exist out there. Like my interest is speaking to my own camp and my interest is critiquing my own camp because I think that is actually a more powerful witness in this cultural moment to people than sitting here and, I don't know, talking about how messed up everybody else is. That just feels like literally scriptural to me. If there's like, why are you trying to grab the speck out of somebody's eye when you got a plank in your eye? Like, I am here for my own people, and the ways that we have acted as if the business practices, like literally, people are sitting here and they're like, the business practices of the Republicans, and it's always Christians in my life, are good practices. And it's like, no, they're not morally good practices when you start to look at some of this stuff, because and if we don't have the power, I'm not saying every Republican policy is bad. I'm not saying every Democrat policy is good. I'm certainly not saying every Democratic policy is good. What I am saying, though, is that if we don't have the ability to look at the policies and the platforms and the regulations and deregulations that happen and start to make sense of why we're in this moment, then we should just, what do they say? Put your head between your legs and kiss your butt goodbye. At this point, what are we even doing here if we can't have these kinds of conversations and say like, and let's just stop pretending here. There's no religious moral good of aligning myself with a particular political party, right? At this point.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing is, I think both you and I, just as we've gotten older, as we've hopefully matured, I don't think either of us is interested in deconstruction for its own sake. Both sitting here because we genuinely want to build something. Like we genuinely want to create something, because you can only be upset at the things that matter. And if we're upset, it's because all of this matters so much to us. And also, I think you maybe also, but I do feel like I never got a good example or a good image or a good model of what it looked like to constructively critique from within.
No,
outside of the great David Foster Wallace water image, to be able to step outside and be able to say, this is a literal bubble. It is one particular bubble of a bunch of bubbles inside of a bigger bubble. And to be able to step outside and constructively critique it and still love what it is. Because I think both of us could say there are people that I grew up with in a little tiny fundamentalist Baptist church in Northern Virginia that, God bless, they've gone on to heaven now, that I still look at and say, I could not be who I am without the love that those people share.
Yeah.
And I think you might be able to say the same thing too. And it's just, there's good, there's bad, anything. This just happens to be the one that we're most exercised about. And I think that being able to have these conversations in public out loud, to be able to take something like surveillance capitalism and say, you know what, this actually deeply intersects with every single thing about who we are and about how we move through the world and about who we want to become. Because if we want to become the kind of people that Christians are supposed to be, we have to take seriously the fact that there are systemic forces in biblical language, powers and principalities that are actively trying to keep us from doing that.
It's just so bizarre to me that, of course, it's our responsibility to critique these things as Christians and not align ourselves in ways that are like, it's just so weird to me because it just seems so obvious. As you point out, the powers and principalities that are like being used for these things, that like we wouldn't see it as our moral duty to be constructive and find ways to help our fellow man. And like that, like somehow we've forgotten courage along the way. Like the fact that we're unable to have these conversations is so cowardly that we're afraid to self-critique. We're afraid to look in. And here's what's really interesting though. I think most conservative evangelicals would not think of themselves as cowardly. They would think that the standing up against the woke and declaring Jesus is a courageous act. But I say what is more is that it does not take a modicum of courage to critique somebody else. What takes courage is to look inside in the ways that we are perpetuating the problems and have aligned ourselves with evil. That's what takes courage. And evangelicalism never wants to admit it's wrong. Like which crazy pastor who's gone off the deep end? I'm probably going to get in trouble for calling them crazy, but let's be honest. You can edit that out if you need to. But which of these dudes, right? And they're dudes for the most part. I do think women have the power to do this too, but a lot of it still is like internalized patriarchy and they're functioning within that. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Who of these dudes has like ever gone on a legitimate repentance tour? The answer is none. They've all gone on PR tours, like 6 months post. Look at what's his name from Hillsong, like going and doing all of this stuff. Like this is all public. I'm not saying anything defamatory, like in the sense that you can go and look on the internet and see these, what looks to me, I won't say it, Steve, it looks to me like a PR tour of there's is just that radical. My family is just that radical. And we read like the Psalms, search me and know my heart, try the ways the church is actually co-opting this same ideology and using it against its own people, right? We actually know there is tech out there and analytics to look at your congregation.
So that's what algorithms do. That's what they average out. And it's just so interesting to me that the evangelical church, especially guilty of this, that entrepreneurial spirit, like we get so excited by this tool to measure the demographics of our church. And we're like, and it's this complete skipping over of the fact that you are actually called to minister to people. You're actually called to be shepherds of individual people, because let's just say there's a parable that talks about the shepherd goes to find the one. But he knows his flock so well that he knows when one is missing. And here's the other thing. It's the outliers that make the news. It's the big ones, it's the weird ones, it's the crazy ones that make the news. There are tons of small churches, medium-sized churches with pastors and congregations who are faithful and are doing exactly what I'm talking about. We're just talking about the trend of American evangelicals who see a new technology and think about it solely in terms of its pragmatic uses.
Oh, yes. There's no theological reflection. There's no Ian Malcolm reflection, right? And I should say, I have a great pastor now, and this is a great example. I actually told my pastor this the other day. We were sitting in church and we do an opening question or two, where it asks just a random question. People talk and answer and whatever. What's your favorite? Do you do New Year's resolutions or not, or whatever? And my son asked me, why does our pastor know like everybody's name? And I was like, the answer is because he's a good pastor. And the reality is that the things you're talking about, like the individualization within the church, which is really fascinating because that feels a little bit like the opposite. We're trying to scale everything for people in the church, and instead of doing the individualized care for people. But yeah, it doesn't work when the push is always to scale up, right? Nobody knows the pastor. And at some point, I really wish pastors would reflect on like, it's not just a problem for your congregation, that your congregation doesn't know you. It's actually a problem for you because because nobody in your congregation knows you. And these same pastors, like their accountability groups are often boards that don't go to the church or other pastors in a network, and they like go on their little pastors retreats and complain about everything. Do you not understand that the reason that you're sitting around and you're complaining about everything is because nobody actually knows you in your real life?
Yeah. That's one of the things. We were talking about this before we started recording, and I was saying, so there's a phrase that's called become ungovernable, and people use it in terms of talking about resisting political regimes and how to create political change. And so one of the things I was thinking about when I was reading Surveillance Capitalism, and I was thinking about this and what you just talked about, and I had this thought, become unscalable.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? And that means the kind of thing, it doesn't mean stop using social media. It doesn't mean go online. It doesn't mean do all your shopping at the grocery store and pay only cash. It means be thoughtful about who you're engaging and why. Be the kind of person that remembers. I used to work for a large megachurch in the Northern Virginia, DC area. And the senior pastor that the church was known for had no idea who the staff was. No idea who anybody on
Wow.
staff. And it was just, we saw him once a month for the all staff meeting. And it was the most bizarre thing. It was like, we literally work 5 days a week, 40 hours a week to make sure that you can get up there and preach for an hour.
So
And I'm not
ridiculous.
saying people weren't blessed by what he said. I'm just saying this was my experience on the inside. Now, there was an executive pastor, CEO type of role, and he was busy. The church was growing gangbusters, staffed probably about 200, 100, 200, revolving staff. But you know what? I would have done anything that executive pastor asked because he never spent a lot of time with each staff member. But anytime he did, if it was 5 minutes, he knew your name and he knew something personal to ask you about.
Yeah.
I would have
It's
done anything for that guy. Wouldn't have done shit for the pastor. But pastor,
It's a really simple, I think there is, as we think through kind of constructive ways of being and modes of being in the world in light of this, I think for me, at least over the next month until we do our next recording, some of the like practical things that I want to explore are like, as you're talking about, like how to not be scalable. Like I already deleted and deactivated my Twitter account at this point because I've felt the shift over the last year of how that platform feels and what it's trying to feed me. And I also have deactivated Threads and I'm about to deactivate Instagram, which I was never like a heavy user on either of those platforms. But just the idea of the ways, I'm assuming you saw all the like, we're getting rid of fact checkers because they're just unhelpful Zuckerberg talk. And of course, it's actually interesting because I looked that up and Zuboff actually had a quick article in response to like a little interview on this. And she was saying like, yeah, of course, when you start out without the proper regulatory practices and you stick fact checkers so far downstream in the process, of course it's going to be chaos. No, fact checkers didn't work, but the fact that, and Zuckerberg is smart enough to know this, right? He's not an idiot. So it's the fact that like, you have to know the facts that if fact checkers are not working, not because fact checking is bad, it's because of how the system is set up, right? It's set up to fail. Then it feels a little disingenuous. And I don't really want to be a part of an app where it feels like what's being communicated to me is like a lack of interest in what is going to benefit me as the consumer. So, and I think I'm really going to think about like, how do I want to connect with people? Right now, I have a pen pal at a prison in Illinois and the art of letter writing. Is that enough to have a pen pal in a different situation of life than I'm in? Does that work as a way of undoing? Do I need to be communicating with everybody that's like me and has a similar experience to me all of the time? That's like the question that I have. And that's what social media feeds, is that sort of need to be around people like that. There are other scenarios in life where it's just hits too close to home to just jump in and communicate about these issues with people in my personal life who don't agree with me. And I'm also thinking about like how to actually, this podcast maybe is one of those ways, but are there ways to put things into the internet and just not consume the internet?
Yeah. And I think this is definitely, for me, this is definitely one of those ways. I don't like what I'm getting. That is a benefit to this technology. We literally have the lowest threshold of entry to actually put something out there. And is it going to change the world? Who knows? That's really not my responsibility.
Is it going to get me in trouble down the road and I'll end up in jail? I don't know, but
did you see Nate Bargatze on Saturday Night Live? His whole skit talking about he's acting as George Washington, and everybody's asking, like, what's going to happen in the future? Nobody knows.
Yeah.
Who knows? And I think that it's really just about Andrew Peterson and his book, The God of the Garden, I think. No, something. It's not that one. It's his other book. But he talks about being a creator and a maker. And let me see if I can find it, and I will try to not cry when I think it is this one. You know what? I'm gonna look it up.
Yeah. And maybe another thing as you're looking that I am thinking about is, as somebody who is an external processor, my hope is that in spending a couple hours a month processing a book, whether that helps anybody else on the internet or not, I don't really care at this point. I hope it is helpful if it's helpful. And if it's not, it doesn't matter.
It helps us. It helps.
And that's my point, is I hope that this helps us in our present, real, physical life live these things out. It helps us
become unscalable. Like becoming unscalable first with us. The quote is from the book Adorning the Dark. Those of us who write, who sing, who paint must remember that to a child, a song may glow like a nightlight in a scary bedroom. It may be the only thing holding back the monsters. The story may be the only beautiful, true thing that makes it through all the ugliness of a little girl's world to rest in her secret heart. May we take that seriously. It is our job. It is our ministry. It is the sword that we swing in the kingdom. To remind children that the good guys win, that the stories are true, and that a fool's hope may be the best kind.
Yeah, that's a really good quote. Really powerful.
This is our little sword. It is what Tolkien said, I bow not yet before the iron crown, nor cast my own small golden scepter down. We're not bowing before the iron crown. Nothing is inevitable. We have the opportunity. And that starts with this conversation.
Yeah.
And
so we'll see in our next little podcast.
Hopefully we'll cover chapters 3 and 4. Hope this conversation whetted your appetite for thinking about surveillance capitalism and moving beyond the grim dark to thinking about where you can find light. So speaking of grim dark, do we want to talk about the silly, non-serious books that we're reading?
We always, yes. So Megan and I read a lot, and we read a lot of different things. It's totally a mix of how many books can I read on so many levels. It satisfies so much in me, more information, learning more things, thinking about things, and then achieving my reading goals. It's everything.
Yeah. So what we're saying is that Rachel and I are the equivalent of the dog who stands in front of the open fire hydrant.
Yeah, I would say what's so interesting about what we might talk about on some of these outside of our big thing that we talk about is that at least what I see on Book Talk is a lot of people have a pretty narrow niche of what they talk about. And so we are just really eclectic. We're going to read Charles Taylor and social scientists and historians and theology and biblical studies and all kinds of stuff. And I obviously for my
cover's pretty. Let's read it.
Yeah. We're also oh, look at this pretty cover. It's about a witch. That sounds fun. Okay. So we're both reading Heartless Hunter right now.
Yes.
How far are you into this book?
Let me look. I think,
because I don't want to spoil anything for you.
Yes.
So the first
I don't know how much you read of it. Let's see.
I'm on page 133. So I'm almost to chapter 19.
Okay, let me see where I am. For crying out loud, let me open the damn book. Okay. I think I'm in chapter 10 or so.
Okay.
I'm in somewhere in the 8, 9, 10 range.
Okay. So I'll try to
I might be a little bit further than you, but I'm not deep into the story.
Okay. So I don't want to spoil any. So are you further ahead or am I further ahead? I'm at 19.
I think I'm a little bit further ahead.
So you're ahead of 19. Okay.
Yes. Page 19, is that what you said?
No, chapter 19.
Oh, then you are ahead.
Okay. So I don't want to spoil anything for you. I will say this. I am a big fan for when I'm listening to a book especially in like fantasy, romantasy world, is like a funny banter, but that's not, I don't like it from a stupid character. I have to like, and so far, I really, Rune, I think that she's I think that she's this sort of this like persona that she's like giving to the world, like this ditzy, whatever, but like she's not. I like that two-sidedness.
So I borrowed Heartless Hunter at the same time that I borrowed Quicksilver.
Oh,
And
okay.
so I ended up just like blitzing Quicksilver.
Yeah.
And so now I have to get back to Heartless Hunter. And just my 5-second review, I think I already told you, fine, nothing groundbreaking. I can see why people like it, and I wouldn't be mad about reading the next one, and I'll probably keep an eye out for it. But it just blows my mind that a dude who would be thousands of years old would be interested in a 20-year-old. But
I know. I don't love like a young female main character who's 8. I'm not talking like with Thorn of Glass. She's 18. I don't want to give anything away, but I'll say this. There's a young character in Thorn of Glass who's with a relationship with a like fae god warrior who's thousands of years old. And you're like, okay, this is weird, but whatever. At this point, I'm suspending a lot of reality because this is like, there's fairies. So like that being a starting point.
Yeah.
I will say
but you specifically talked about, I have picked up about Heartless Hunter, and I don't think this spoils anything, is that it is based on blood med.
Yes.
So it requires blood power a spell.
Okay, spoiler for anyone that doesn't want to read, it's just, you don't have to like timestamp this or something, but okay, I haven't read a lot of blood magic stuff. This is unfamiliar. I don't read a lot of sapphic or like the vampire. Maybe I will this summer. I don't know, but it's just not been my thing. Fairies have been more my thing and dragons have been my thing. So absolutely will be reading Onyx Storm when it comes out. Next week is already pre-ordered. Can't wait. But the fact that she casually mentioned that she does her blood magic with her period blood. This was like a topic of conversation at the dinner table last night. I was like, I'm reading a book where the main character is storing her period blood and then using it for her magic, whatever, is her symbols. Yes. I about threw out. What? And I read it so like goes.
Let's be okay. A couple of years ago, I helped you create makeup for your kids for Halloween. And you had a bottle of fake blood. And you and I both literally gagged.
I know. It's gross. And she's keeping vials. It becomes the central point. One time she knocks over a vial. I haven't got this part. I'm not spoiling anything, but she knocks over a vial of blood. She's like, oh no, my period blood. And the fact that we're just talking about period blood so lackadaisically in this book. And nobody's got, and everybody's, oh my God, this book's so good. Heartless Hunter, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, am I just not initiated into this world enough where I should be comfortable with people carrying on?
Because to be perfectly honest, any other book that I have read where blood magic, like blood is the power for the spell, has never referenced period blood.
And then she's also on top of that. This is like early in the book, guys. So if you read this and you're like, or listen to this and you're like, oh, she's spoiling the book, you're going to get this in the first like 6 or 7 chapters. Her friend is also storing her period blood. So they even go into explaining when she uses her old period blood, she can't cast as strong of a spell. But when she uses her friend's old period blood, because it's somebody else's blood, she can cast a stronger spell.
That was like, wait, what?
I'm like, okay, this is weird. And all I can think of the whole time, because this is the thing with these fantasies. Do they have cars or horse-strong? Like, when is this happening? And what is the technology level at the time? But do they have a diva cup? Like, how is she collecting her? All I'm imagining is her having a diva cup, pulling it out, and then pouring it in a vial.
I know.
Is that what's happening?
That's the thing, because when I was in undergrad, I took English classes with this woman. My family still knows when I talk about her that it's a capital H-E-R, her, because she was like terrifying. But she was basically trained us to think about how science fiction and fantasy worlds were constructed. And this is why because I think you just finished N.K. Jemisin's 5th season.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Jemison does such a fantastic job of constructing the world and of showing you throughout the characters' actions and interactions how this world is constructed and how the magic works.
Yes.
And that's where the kind of Heartless Hunter, it's interesting, but I'm not sure that the author really fully thought through, because if the reader is sitting there wondering how this works,
I'm
really put this all together.
I'm just really hyper fixated on the collection of the period blood, and I can't get over it. But I will say this. I think the banter in the book, especially as you get going, not so much at the beginning. Gideon was kissing me off at first, and I was like, are you kidding me? This dude's like such a little annoying dude. But it's getting better. And the more they reveal, and I do the like slow sort of reveal of some key information about witches and like their relationship with certain witches and things like that, I've really enjoyed. And I'm at a really funny point in the book right now where it's like the interactions between them. I thought it was going to be more like partner together, unfortunately, but it's more like right now, at least, it's more like I'm trying. It feels like, do you remember when you watched like How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days? And it was like they were both trying to undercut the other one. It feels a lot like that.
Okay.
I found myself like laughing at certain parts. Whereas I feel like, have you read Powerless? Have you read that one yet? It's like the girl.
I don't think so. Didn't they make a movie out of it or a TV?
No, I think okay. So have you read, is it The Red Queen? Have you read that series at all?
I don't think so.
Basically, Powerless is like a ripoff of The Red Queen. There's all kinds of controversy. I won't get into it here, but there's a lot of controversy and accusations.
A Red Queen?
I can't see. Pull it over.
Oh, sorry.
And then,
okay.
Yeah, but I haven't read that one, but I have read Powerless, and it's pretty big right now. But the whole premise is like, everybody in the world has powers, but this one girl doesn't have powers, and they kill everybody that doesn't have powers, and she like ends up in it, and there's a Hunger Games trial situation. And people love the banter in Powerless. I found it a little bit like, we're just saying the same banter over and over again. I think the banter in this one is better. I actually think the banter and I haven't read the second one, but in Divine Rivals as well. I didn't love Divine Rivals, but I thought the banter was good in that book.
Okay. Did you read, let me see. Yeah. Did you read, we've talked about Sarah Moss. I think that's her name.
Oh, yeah. No, yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So you're reading a different series than I read.
What do you read? Oh, you're reading you read Crescent City. That's the one I haven't read.
I read that one, but she had another one.
There's ACOTAR. Oh, the trilogy. Crescent City's a trilogy right now.
Crescent City's a trilogy, but I think there's another one where maybe it's Court of Thorn and Roses.
Yeah, it's not a trilogy though. There's 5 of them now. I've read 4 of them.
Yeah. Oh, anyway.
But honestly,
I read a lot, and I read in the middle of the night because I wake up at all times. And,
Megan has insomnia, so she reads all the time at weird hours. My like favorite time of the night now is I like get in bed and I put my headphones on and I like listen to my book, and then I like play a little stupid game and listen to and that's like my favorite. Like it's like never anything important. It's like a stupid book about.
You don't listen to a book? I can't retain anything.
When you listen to an audiobook?
No, the only time I have ever listened to an audiobook is, and I remember this very clearly, I was on a road trip for work to Jacksonville, Florida. It was right before everything shut down for COVID, and I was listening to Carrie Elway's memoir about filming Princess Bride.
Okay, I want to say 2 things that have helped me with, actually 3 things that have helped me with audiobooks. One, I just let go of the need to retain. Like, I am listening to an audiobook for a vibe, and that is it. Like, I was explaining this to someone else. Like, I'm not reading a Heartless Hunter because I care a thing about what happens in this book. I just want a vibe. And it's the same as somebody says, oh, how can you read that drivel? Because do you ever watch like The Bachelor? Do you ever watch something silly on TV? This is The Bachelor. Okay. And then when I'm watching like PBS or like some documentary, that's this. Okay. And then if I'm watching like some nice, thoughtful, it's going to win an award, I'm reading something like this. I have the capacity and the desire to read all of the things. So I like my audiobooks are books I'm like, I do not care if I retain any of this because I'm here for vibes. And number one. Number two, you've got to get the speed right for you. You've got to get the listening speed. And then number three, I do way better when I have noise canceling headphones on listening to an audiobook than when I don't. It's my brain can't do the noise around me and an audiobook. I struggle. But if I have noise canceling on and I'm like doing chores and I'm like into an audiobook, it's so good. And then sometimes you get a little attached to a narrator. I think that like the Mistborn, I just listened to Mistborn, the first book. I thought the narrator was like awesome in that book. I'm here for this man. When I listen to, you know what you got to do? Just go and listen to Lord of the Rings, Andy Serkis narration.
I know. I was just thinking about that the other day and I was like, because I just finished my annual tradition. I'm 2/3 of the way through my annual tradition of watching through Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I know.
Ended for all of y'all out there.
Yeah.
But, and so I was thinking about that because I was like, I want to read the books again because it's been so long. And my imagination now is so formed by the movies, which is great. They did such a fantastic job with that. But I want to read the books again. I remember when I was a kid and the first time I read through Lord of the Rings, it was the middle of the night because I didn't sleep when I was a kid. And I remember laying there in bed, finishing Lord of the Rings and going, you fool, whatever made you think you could write? It's been so long. And I probably will have that reaction because it's been so long.
It's so good. And I would say the Lord of the Rings movies are great, but there's all these little side quests that you miss when you are watching the movie because they had to do these things, right?
They had to edit.
But the biggest mistake, in my opinion, you know what I'm going to say here, is Faramir. They did him dirty in the movies because I first had listened to the books. I never read Lord of the Rings. All I had was the lore and being in Christian spaces where literally everyone talks about the Inklings all the time. And I finally was like, I'm going to listen to these. It's going to feel less daunting. And when I listened to Return of the King last year, I was like, I'm sorry, what? Who is this Faramir declaring his love like the boss that he is? Like, why did I not get this Faramir in the flippin' movies? Because he's so much better. And it's such a wonderful, in my opinion, such a wonderful foil to Boromir. The foil that Tolkien creates in the books. Creates such an interesting conversation point. And that is lost in the movies, I think.
Yeah, it is. Of course, I personally am sad that they did not put Tom Bombadil.
Yeah.
But I understand why it wouldn't be in the movie. You would end up having diversion in the side quest, but you have to, Tom Bombadil is that this is a person who has the right to future tense and privacy.
Yes. And also, I don't want to ruin anything for you, but I know you're not going to watch it, but Tom Bombadil does show up in other Lord of the Rings things.
Okay.
So I'm not going to, you do you. I personally really liked Rings of Power, even though Galadriel pissed me off so bad. Literally season 2, I'm just like, are you kidding me? Everybody still, but the rings. But I will say there was some really, truly unbelievable scenes when watching the demise of Celebrimbor was expertly done, in my opinion. So say what you want about Rings of Power, but the demise of Celebrimbor in season 2 was like, they were trying to do a lot in season 2. And I still am like pissed at Galadriel because I think she's a dummy. I'm like, you got a long character.
This is where you could be grateful for someone who lives for thousands of years because by the time you get to the Lord of the Rings, character arc.
I know. I'm hoping there's trying to be like a long ass character arc here because right now, everything she does, you're just like, friends. This man is no good. He's no good. But I would say that the Celebrimbor stuff was just like, whoa. It gets you thinking a lot. I think it gets you thinking a lot about the ways that we deceive ourselves and understanding the ways that Sauron deceives is really interesting and informative for when you're thinking about Lord of the Rings, the trilogy. Have you watched that Riders of Rohirrim or whatever, that animated thing that came out in December and got no publicity whatsoever? It was like in the theater, I think. Let me see if I can find it. What's this? Right? No, it's not this. Hold on. Lord of the Rings. Yeah, there it is. Riders of the Rohirrim.
Okay.
I've not watched it. I literally don't know anything if it's any good or whatever, but
what are you looking forward to reading next?
Oh, what a great question. So I am wrapping up I was like a really fat fantasy romantasy situation. Yeah. So I'm wrapping up. I just wrapped up the duology, One Dark Window and Two Twisted Crowns. And I actually really enjoyed that. I actually enjoyed the second one, I think, more than the first one. I wouldn't say they're like life changing. Some people are like really huge fans. They're like, the magic system. And the magic system is cool. Yeah. But I
need to go back to the second one. I read the first one. Yeah. I need to go back to the second one. Yeah.
I actually, so the second one really focuses, I think if you were going in thinking that the primary focus is going to be on Raven and Elspeth, it's not. It's actually on Elm and Ione and their perspectives. And I actually felt like that was really refreshing. The other ones still have chapters, but you're getting... And there was very satisfying. I say the end, the antagonist, I felt very satisfied. So I was so ready for his demise because he pissed me off so bad. And so that felt really good. So I just finished Two Twisted Crowns. I'm in the middle of When the Moon Hatched. I'm like not that far in. I'm like 10% in. So I can't, but it's like it's like dragons and then they like go and they die in the sky.
I haven't put it in my hold yet.
Yeah. So I'm into that. And then I'm all, like I said, I'm like 30% through Heartless Hunter. So I would imagine I'll finish this weekend. And so my next book on my list, I have a couple actually. So on my Kindle right now, I have actually pull up what I just got from Libby. There's a few on Libby that I'm working on after. So I will finish When the Moon Hatched. It may be by a audiobook because I only have 10 days left with it and it's long. But the next nonfiction, now that I've caught up on Surveillance Capitalism, I'm going to start is The Challenger by Adam Higginbotham, which is actually the story of the explosion of the Challenger. So that's going to be, I think, really interesting. It's that book. I'm going to try to get through it. Of course, there's people waiting in line at Libby as these things go. So we'll see. And the other one that I am going to be looking at is called Good Material by Dolly Alderton. So now I'm going into the lit fic section here. This is about, it says Andy loves Jen, Jen loved Andy, and he can't work out why she stopped. Now he is without a home, waiting for his stand-up career to take off, wondering why everyone else around him seems to have grown up while he wasn't looking. Set adrift in the sea of heartbreak, Andy clings to the idea of solving the puzzle of his ruined relationship. So it's sort of like a lit fic kind of situation. So I have that actively. And then the other one I have is Peter Swanson's A Talent for Murder, which... Yes. So I got a thriller. Obviously we're here for that. A newlywed librarian begins to suspect the man she married might be a murderer in this spectacularly twisty and deviously clever novel by Peter Swanson.
Okay. I'm putting that on my hold.
Yeah. Now. And then finally, what I'm really excited about is this book, Orbital by Samantha Harvey. And this is a real short read. And the nice thing is that A Talent for Murder and Orbital are both available for me on Hoopla. So I can listen to the audiobooks which means I'm going to bust through these really fast because I'll just, basically it will become my life for a day where I'll read when I can read. And then when I have to get up, I'll have the audiobook on in my ear and the book will finish. But I think I actually heard on TikTok, I listened to a speech that she gave. It might have been when she was accepting the Booker Prize and it was like so beautiful and heartfelt. And I was like, and like very encouraging in our sort of like bleak reality. And I was like, oh, this is going to be great. But this won the Booker Prize last year. And so this is, a slender novel of epic power named a Best Book of the Year by Oprah Daily and The Guardian. Orbital deftly snapshots one day in the lives of 6 women and men traveling through space. So there's your little short So that's my January wrap. That's what I'm hoping to get through for the rest of January.
Okay. Ambitious.
I've already gotten through 6 books this month. And my favorite has been, which I was actually really surprised, but again, I was reading for vibes. Actually, I'll tell you 2 books that were pleasant and enjoyment for me. The first was, I've read a lot of YA stuff recently. A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson was so cute.
No, I'm thinking of Holly Black. Holly Black has written Fae books.
Okay.
Those might be good. Okay, yeah.
But yeah, it was like a story about a girl who's like investigating a murder in her town, and it's for her senior project at school. So it's like a little bit of like a Nancy Drew kind of vibe. And I don't know how you feel about thrillers. You know how I feel.
Read them. I do read. I like reading.
And I will say,
horror novels, I'll do them.
And I will say, for me, the litmus test of, is this a good thriller? It's one, I hate when a protagonist makes a stupid decision for the sake of moving the plot along. That irritates me. Yeah. I know I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm like, I hate you now, and I hope you die. Yeah. And so that was not a situation in this book. There's a couple stupid things she did, but not super stupid. It felt, for an 18-year-old girl doing like research, it felt reasonable. And number 2, I want the twist at the end to be unhinged, but not so unhinged that everybody kept talking about this book last year called Behind Her Eyes. And I was like, I got to the end and I was like, this is the most unhinged plot twist I've ever read in my life. Like, it's absolutely absurd. This felt like the right level of unhinged to me. And I can't tell you what that level is. I know when you've crossed it, and I'm not a fan at that point.
Yeah. Have I recommended, it's the first, I don't know if it's going to be like a long-standing series or like a trilogy or whatever, but it's called Bless Your Heart by Lindy Ryan.
No, tell me about it.
It is a crackling mystery horror novel with big-hearted character and southern charm with a bite. Bless Your Heart is a gasp-worthy delight from start to finish from debut author Lindy Ryan.
Oh, this looks interesting.
Evan's women have some undead to kill. So they run a funeral parlor in a small town in Texas. And it's basically a front because they're vampire slayers.
I love that. Is it cozy or is it like scary?
I'd say it's a good mix of both. Like, there's definite tension at the end.
Okay.
Like, you're kind of like, some of the things that get revealed, you're like, holy crap. But it is really also a story about family.
Okay.
And like, how do you remember how when we were watching who's our dude on Netflix, Haunting of Hill House?
Oh, Flanagan. Mike Flanagan, Midnight Mass. What?
And Midnight Mass.
Yeah.
And we were watching it and we're like, this is the literal definition of the call is coming from inside the house.
Yeah.
Vampire.
I love it.
I'm not saying that's what's in Bless Your Heart, but it's that same kind of thing. You have these very real vampires, but you also have this reckoning with family history and secrets and
that's fun.
Future and all that stuff. So I like that. So that one I do recommend. So I've read that not too long ago. Let me see. So since I just put on A Talent for Murder, that's going to be available sooner rather than later. One of my friends recommended this. I think it's a memoir. Yeah. It's by Stephanie Fu, and it's called What My Bones Know. And so
I feel like I've heard of that.
Maybe. It's healing from complex trauma. So a friend of mine recommended that. So I've got that on hold, and that should be available soon. And then as far as fantasy fiction, I had on hold for a while, The Courting of Bristol Keats by Mary Pearson.
Okay.
So it looks like it's a thrilling romantic fantasy full of dangerous fae, dark secrets, and addictive romance, as they say. So I've got that. And then I've got this book, The Half King by Melissa Landers. So I'm hoping to get that soon.
Okay. Read any? I have 2 recs. I wouldn't say one's like our rec.
And you recommended Blood Over Brighthaven. I've got that on my hold.
Okay.
It's not going to be for a few more weeks.
Hold on. Okay, I got another book to recommend too over here. Okay, so I read 2 Christmas books this year. This one was just absolutely, this is a Hallmark movie in a book, right? Kiss Me at Christmas by Jenny Bayless. If you're into Hallmark movie Christmas books, I needed something that was just going to be like, the spice level is like pretty PG in this one. And it's like very, maybe PG-13, but not anything. Okay. Whew. This book also mine has sprayed edges. So that's like a whole vibe. Okay. I can't tell you anything about this without ruining it. But when you do read it, I can't wait to hear what you think, because I will say this.
It'll probably be a couple of months.
I know, no pressure, but when you do, you will, a lot of the questions that we're talking about with surveillance capitalism, I think there are some overlaps here.
Interesting. Okay. So this is interesting. So remember the other day I texted you and I was like, I'm embarrassed to admit that I snorted at this. Like I'm reading the, I sent you the quote. So the book, I can't believe I'm admitting this online. The book is called Lights Out. I was intrigued to read this because this is how it's described. This is the opening line for the description. The viral TikTok stalker dark romance, burning with high heat, hilarious banter, and a love story like you've never seen before. And I'm like, those things don't go together.
Yeah, I actually saw this. I've seen this book recommended on TikTok in the romance world.
I will say it's probably one of the better books in general that I've read in a long time in terms of dialogue and humor and all that stuff. Now, I'm also just going to say it is a hard R in terms of
what's in it.
The romance. I'm just telling y'all, your mileage may vary.
Read.
It was funny. And I could not stop cackling when I read this book.
Yeah.
But it's actually about digital technology for surveillance.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I love how you said it when we met for lunch at Christmas. Chaotic readers.
Yeah,
we're chaotic readers.
We're chaotic readers. We love to read all kinds of things. And we like to use it as a means of exploring what we're interested in.
And by the way, one more recommendation or question. Have you read the trilogy by Naomi Novik, the Scalomance trilogy? A Deadly Education. Homework. You have to read it. The first one is A Deadly Education.
Okay.
But it's a Scalomance trilogy. It is so stinking good.
I'm looking it up on Libby right now.
Yes. It's so good.
Oh, yeah, I've seen this before. Okay. So I also read this little book by Emily McGowan. It's the Fullness of Time series.
Okay.
Yeah, about the liturgical calendar. And this is about Christmas. And
nice.
I know, I think Emily does a really good job of writing in a way that's like very accessible, but meaningful. And I really enjoyed engaging with the Christmas season and like what it means to celebrate Christmastide, and having that book alongside is very short. So I also read that and would definitely recommend for anyone looking for a Christmas book.
Just to round out our chaotic reading of across the genres, I am working my way through the most recent book that was published from Dallas Willard's writing. This is The Scandal of the Kingdom.
Oh, how's that?
So good. I credit Dallas Willard with keeping me a Christian when I was in my 20s when I read The Divine Conspiracy. Because the first thing it showed me was that you could be an intellectual, an academic, and be a Christian. And just like growing up in the church that I did, it's like you can't be message I got, but you can't be an artist and a Christian. It was also like academics and studying. It was going to take you too far from the truth. And so to read Dallas Willard, for him, that was just keeping me a Christian. And so so all of that to say, I'm just an automatic Dallas Willard stan. But The Scandal of the Kingdom is really looking at Jesus in the Gospels. What was he doing through the parables? And why was it literally so scandalous? And again, this intersects with what we were talking about with surveillance capitalism, economics, and an economics system untethered from any moral framework. And exploitation and manipulation are as old as history, right? We've got different technologies for it now. And so Willard is really just pulling out, like, why were his parables so scandalous? Like, why were they so subversive? but it was also like unscalable.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So that is our inaugural episode.
Fun. Yeah, it was very fun and very helpful and encouraging. So let's do it again next month.
See y'all next month. Bye.
Bye.